Hey friends, welcome back to the channel. So, from around 2019 through to 2021, I listened to about 500 podcast episodes. And to be honest, other than books probably, podcasts are the single biggest source of inspiration and ideas and learnings that I've basically ever had in my life. And when I started this YouTube channel in 2017, I knew so little about things like marketing and branding and filming and growing a business and any of this sort of stuff, but it was through listening to a bunch of podcasts over the years that I've gotten the knowledge to do that, and now this YouTube channel and the business around it is reasonably successful. So for this video, I went back through 4 years worth of podcast listening history, and these are the 20 podcasts that I would say have had a significant impact on my life and on my business in that time. Let's start off with interviewee type, conversational type podcasts, and the number one on this list is the Tim Ferriss Show, which I first started listening to, I think around 2016. This is the podcast that I've listened to the most episodes of, and even though I've only listened to a few dozen episodes out of the several hundred he's got in the back catalog, I would say that this is probably the single biggest podcast that's most changed my life. And mainly for me, the value of the Tim Ferriss Show has been in hearing Tim Ferriss interviewing people who I might not have otherwise come across. There's a few episodes in particular that come to mind. There was one interview that he did with a chap called Derek Sivers, who then I really enjoyed his appearance on the podcast, and then I followed all of Derek's work and read all his blog posts and read his books, and actually reached out to him to do an interview on my own YouTube channel, and now he and I are friends and we talk occasionally, and it's turned into like this cool relationship from this guy who I discovered through the Tim Ferriss Show. A few years ago, I also listened to an episode that Tim Ferriss did with Mr. Money Mustache, who is a financial independence and early retirement type blogger on the internet. And I'd never heard of this financial independence movement until I listened to that episode. And then I was like, oh, this is interesting. And I went down the rabbit hole of the FIRE movement, financial independent, retire early. And I discovered Mr. Money Mustache and a bunch of other personal finance bloggers. And it was through reading all that stuff a few years ago that I really started to take things like investing and, budgeting and trying to make more money, all of that stuff a bit more seriously. And more recently, the various episodes that Tim's done on crypto, interviewing kind of experts in the world of crypto, has helped me go down that rabbit hole as well. And so really the reason I recommend the Tim Ferriss Show to everyone is not that you'll get some amazing productivity tips or some business advice or anything like that. It's more that it's just a really cool way to discover interesting people, and then if you vibe with their ideas that you hear in the podcast, then you can choose to follow those rabbit holes. Next, we have The Knowledge Project, which is a podcast by Shane Parrish of Farnham Street, and that's also an interview type podcast. It is a bit more low key than the Tim Ferriss Show, but Shane also has like really cool and interesting guests on. In fact, the first time I heard of a guy called Naval was on his episode of The Knowledge Project, and that episode was just packed with so much value, and I remember the feeling of listening to it and just my mind being blown like 24/7, not 24/7, for the 3 hours while I was listening to it. And then obviously I discovered Naval and kind of went on a rabbit hole exploring his tweets, exploring his own podcast, even buying his book that came out, well, not his book, a book that came out recently called The Almanac of Naval Ravikant, which is very good and has like a distillation of his life wisdom. There was also a good episode of The Knowledge Project where he interviewed Esther Perel, who's a relationships expert who writes a lot about this and does relationships counseling. And that again was an incredible mind-blowing episode that then introduced me to the work of Esther Perel. So again, the way I see these interview podcasts, it's not like, hey, every single podcast I'm taking insights away from it, although that is true. In fairness, I've forgotten most of them because I don't really have a good process for taking notes and revisiting them, but it's more like, oh wow, I really enjoyed the interview with that person, therefore I'm gonna explore their content a little bit more. Next on the list, we have Deviate by Rolf Potts. Now, Rolf Potts is a chap who wrote a book called Vagabonding, which I also discovered through Tim Ferriss. And what Rolf did was that he spent, I think 20 years ago, he spent some large amount of time just like traveling around the world with himself and a suitcase and writing about that experience of kind of being a vagabond. And he did this way before this solo traveling stuff was cool. So I read the book because Tim Ferriss said it had an impact on him, so I read the book, I really liked it. And then when Rolf Potts started his own podcast, I started listening to that. And now this is a bit less in the way of like business advice and stuff, but it's more like a generally interesting life type podcast because he tends to interview people who are also into the whole traveling thing. One of the real values I get from things like that is that you've probably heard that thing that you are the average of the 5 people closest to you. And the sorts of people that you have around you do tend to define your kind of box, like, your box of possibilities in life. And so if you're friends with a bunch of people, or, your parents are friends with a bunch of people who are all doctors, chances are you're gonna think, oh, this medicine thing is pretty cool. Equally, if you start to become friends with people who are tech founders or YouTubers, suddenly starting a startup or starting a YouTube channel is gonna seem like a totally normal thing to do, and you're more likely to do it. And I think the value of podcasts like this is in the fact that it exposes you to people that you might not have come across before. And so I'd never really seriously considered the idea of long-term traveling because it just it was outside my box of possibilities. But then when I started listening more to Rolf Potts and the people he interviews, it then became more of a thing and sort of expanded my horizons a bit, that, oh, this is something that people can do and I can do it as well. Oh, and by the way, if you want to check out any of these podcasts, they're all going to be linked in the video description, and also links to all the books that I'm mentioning in this particular video, so you can check those out if you like. Next, we have a pretty interesting podcast called Bookworm. Now, Bookworm is not a very mainstreamy podcast. Tim Ferriss, Shane Parrish, these are all fairly mainstream, but Bookworm is a bit of a hidden treasure, I think. And it's these two dudes in America who just talk about books. Like every week, they read a new book, or every other week, and then they discuss it. And so I actually found a bunch of book recommendations through the Bookworm podcast that I might not have come across before. This one, Make Time, is a book that I discovered through the Bookworm podcast. And so I read the book and I really liked it, and then I actually made a video about the book and then reached out to the author John Zaratsky, who then I had on an old episode of my own podcast. And actually now John and I are internet friends. So the other day I hopped on a Zoom call with him where he was giving me advice for how to write my own book. And so I discovered this through the Bookworm podcast. And there have been a bunch of books where I've been thinking, oh, I don't know if I should read this book. And then hearing these two guys on the Bookworm podcast discuss the book has either made me decide to read it or decide to not read it. And either way, it's been a way of saving time and just listening to an interesting conversation about interesting stuff like books. Next on the list, we have Not Overthinking. Now, Not Overthinking is actually the weekly podcast that I do with my brother. This has been going on for the last 3 years. If you didn't know it was a thing, it's a thing. We have a YouTube channel, we do video podcasts as well. And he and I just talk about, life and happiness and anything in between that's on our minds. And so when I was going through my podcast history, I found that I've re-listened to episodes of Not Overthinking around about 15 times, just because it's kind of interesting. And it's now particularly interesting looking at the back catalog, 3 years ago, what's the sort of stuff me and my brother were thinking about. Again, links to that in the video description if you want to check it out. There's a few more interview podcasts that I listen to sporadically. There's one called Invest Like the Best, which is very good. There's the North Star podcast with David Perel. There's the Art of Manliness podcast. There's Impact Theory and the School of Greatness. Those are some of the standard ones that I will dabble with occasionally if they seem to have a good guest on. And recently I've started listening to The Diary of a CEO as well, which is a podcast by Stephen Bartlett that I was actually interviewed on about as a productivity expert. So you can check that out if you like. And in fact, if I can plug another one of my things, The Diary of a CEO was kind of the model that we used to start my own podcast recently, a few months ago, called Deep Dive with Ali Abdaal. Again, we have a YouTube channel for that. It'll be linked down below, and it's also available on all the podcast platforms. And every week we have basically a long form interview, like me having a conversation with someone else. And so I've interviewed a bunch of authors and creators and entrepreneurs and other cool people, and we just talk about, how they find fulfillment in work and in life. So you can check that out if you like. This was kind of the culmination of me having listened to these sorts of interview podcasts for the last 5 years and deciding, you know what, this actually seems like a cool way to connect with people. I want to do one of these things myself. All right, let's move on to the category of health. Now, sadly, I only listen to one health podcast, and that is the Huberman Lab. That's a podcast I've started listening to fairly recently when I decided, hey, I was going to take more care of my health. And the Huberman Lab podcast is amazing. It's by this guy called Andrew Huberman, who is a professor of neurobiology and ophthalmology at Stanford School of Medicine. And each episode, he does a deep dive into a specific part of what the science says about how we can live kind of healthier, better lives. And so one episode in particular that's really had an impact on me is this episode all about optimizing sleep. And he goes through the evidence in about 3 hours, and he brings in a bunch of studies, and he turns it into this actionable advice that you can do right now to just automatically level up your sleep. And so now I've started following some of his recommendations, and we're working on a video about that as we speak. Next, we have the category of business podcasts. Now, these are probably the ones that have most contributed to kind of the business success of this YouTube channel and the kind of business and the business around it, because these are more focused on things like marketing and operations and growth and that kind of stuff. The first one on the list is the My First Million podcast, which I've listened to a few dozen episodes of and started listening to, I think, when it first came out. And the premise of My First Million is that these two guys, Sean and Sam, were interviewing people about how they made their first $1 million. Which was just super interesting. And so for the first several dozen episodes, they were interviewing these cool people and kind of riffing on business ideas with them and trying to understand how they started these interesting businesses that ended up getting to $1 million. These days, the focus of the podcast has changed a bit. It's now more about Sam and Sean sort of kind of breaking down other creators who've done really well, or businesses, or just riffing on business ideas by themselves. And to be honest, one of the main things I've taken away from this is just the general meta idea that making money on the internet through businesses is actually not that hard. There are loads of people doing it, and there are loads of models for it. And no, you don't have to make a YouTube channel where you have your face on camera kind of giving advice. There are zillions of business models that you can do, and just hearing how other people have done it, I've always found really helpful in just sparking ideas in my own head. Oh, if I wasn't doing this YouTube channel thing and this wasn't going well, I could do this or that or this or that. And the more of these podcasts I listen to, the more confidence I get that even if this whole YouTube channel goes to pot and everything dies, I could probably start again completely from scratch and just build another business, and it would be super fun and I'd enjoy the journey, and it could probably be reasonably successful after some time as well. And the weird thing is that like I speak to a bunch of people who want to start businesses. Like, you know, there's friends of mine, there's like colleagues when I was working as a doctor, and also when I used to do fan meetups, people would be like, oh, I really want to start this business. And I'd be like, oh, what podcast do you listen to? And they would be like, oh, I don't really listen to podcasts. They're like, okay, what books have you read about business? Oh, yeah, I don't really read. Okay, so it just completely baffles me as to like there is so much knowledge out there in terms of how to build and grow a business. You know, there's like so many books, so many audiobooks. They're basically free, they're very cheap, and you know, I'm sure you can find ways to get them for free if you absolutely need to. Podcasts everywhere are completely free. The amount of knowledge you can get from podcasts from other people who have built $1 million plus businesses, riffing on business ideas, is just absolutely astronomical. And so over the last few years, I've really been shoving podcasts and audiobooks and books down the throats of people I've met who are like, oh, I want to start a business and make money on the internet, but I don't know how. It's like, dude, listen to podcasts and you will find out how. Next, we have a podcast which is on the same vein as My First Million, but a little bit less clickbaity. It's called Indie Hackers. And that's really interesting because it's interviews with indie developers, like individuals who in their own bedrooms or in their own, like, you know, one-man band have started internet businesses that have made, you know, $1,000 a month, 10K a month, 100K a month, $1 million a month, just through, again, all sorts of different things. You know, there's people who've like bought and sold domain names, there's people who've built website builders, people who've done like messaging apps, like people who've built all sorts of things on the internet. And these are interviews where they explain how they did it and what the thought process was and how they came up with the ideas and how they grew and what the feeling is now that they're sitting on this, you know, making 5 million a year off this one software thing where it's just them and one of their mates just doing it together. And I used to listen to this a lot when I was in the software thing because I used to code and would build software apps and stuff. And it would always give me some really good ideas for businesses that I could do. And so again, if I lost everything on this YouTube channel, the way I'd get back to making money again would probably be through coding up some kind of software product. And I'd be kind of binging the Indie Hackers back catalog for ages to be like, okay, let me find some ideas in here. Next, we have a pair of podcasts, Noah Kagan Presents and Online Marketing Made Easy by Amy Porterfield. So Amy and Noah, they're both like marketing-y type podcasts, and they both like sometimes do interviews, sometimes do solo episodes. I remember, so for Noah Kagan, I listened to 20 of his episodes, and for Online Marketing Made Easy, I listened to 12 of her episodes around about 2019, 2020, when I was focused on like, oh, how do we market this business? How do we grow our courses? All that kind of stuff, and that was super useful. And then we have the Naval podcast. This is a really good book, The Almanac of Naval Ravikant. I mentioned him when I discovered him on the Farnham Street podcast. He has his own mini podcast where it's not a regular thing. He's just recorded a bunch of episodes expanding on his ideas of how to get rich without getting lucky. And it's really good. Again, link in the video description if you want to check out any of these. Next, we have a few podcasts related to being a YouTuber and being a creator. So number one on that list is the Video Creators Podcast by a chap called Tim Schmoyer and his team. I've listened to 31 of those episodes in the last like 12, 18 months or so. I don't listen to them religiously because they have like lots of varying advice for YouTubers. But if something catches my fancy, I'll just like, you know, add it to my list. And it's a very easy listen, and I often get useful tips for growing the YouTube channel. And then we have the Gary V audio experience. Gary Vaynerchuk is one of my kind of internet guru idol type people. He's not everyone's cup of tea, but if you can get over kind of the kind of brash way that he talks, the advice that he gives, and the way that he's built a $1 billion business with a team of 1,500 people while also doing his like just making loads and loads of content on the internet as a side hustle, and how he's been doing that for the last like 10 plus years, since way before it was cool, is just like super inspiring. And Gary's always seems to be at the forefront of what is going on in the world. So he was, you know, encouraging people to get on TikTok way before it was cool. He was encouraging people to get on LinkedIn way before people started blowing up on LinkedIn. He's been pushing this whole NFT thing. And if I actually had listened to more of his podcast episodes in the last sort of 12 months, I would have probably jumped on the NFT craze a lot sooner than I actually did. And then we have 5 podcasts that are run by creators or creator friends. So there's That Creative Life by Sarah Dietschy. There's the Stalman Podcast by Tyler Stalman. There's the Secret Podcast, which is Matt D'Avella's Patreon exclusive podcast, which I've been a Patreon of his for the last few years. So that's an interesting podcast. There's the Matti and Pete Show, which is Peter McKinnon and Matti Hippoya. And there's the Tuxedo Time podcast, which is Becky and Chris. So these are either creators that I'm friends with. Oh, actually, no, all of these guys started off as creators that I admired on the the internet, and for most of them now, I'm actually internet friends with these guys. Never met any of them in real life, but it's gonna happen at some point. And so I have their podcast on my subscription feed as well, and when an interesting episode comes up, I'll listen to it, and it's just kind of nice. And then we come on to the category of finance. Now, there's two podcasts I want to mention here. Number one is the Property Podcast, which is run by a company called Property Hub, which is a very niche specific podcast for property investors in the UK. So if you are not a property investor or want to be a property investor in the UK, you're not going to get any value out of it. But I've had enormous value out of podcast number 2 on the list, which is Smart Passive Income by Pat Flynn. I've been listening to this for absolutely years. It's just had so many episodes that have been so helpful in helping me think about how to monetize a creative business like this one. And now Pat Flynn and I are internet friends, and he introduced me to my book writing coach, who I mentioned I was struggling with writing a book, and he said, oh, you've got to connect with this guy called Azul, and now Azul and I are working together, and there's all these like serendipitous connections that happen. So many of these have happened because I have listened to someone's podcast and then started following them on Twitter or on YouTube, and then kind of they've got to know of me as my channel has grown bigger, and then I've kind of become internet friends with these people, which is always a really cool thing. And honestly, I think this is one of the best parts of being a creator on the internet these days. Like, obviously it's nice having the audience, it's nice being able to make videos, it's nice being able to make money, but really the single best thing about it is probably the friends that you make along the way, as corny and cliche as that sounds. Now, if you decide you're into this whole interview thing, you should definitely check out my deep dive podcast. That is all available down below, and we'll put a link over here somewhere as well. But a year before I started this, during the pandemic, I actually did I think a few dozen remote interviews with these sorts of people that I admire on the internet. And I did those interviews as YouTube live streams at the time, but they're no longer available on the channel. Instead, they are all available on Nebula. Now, if you haven't heard, Nebula is an independent streaming platform that's built by me and a bunch of other creators. And on Nebula, we can put exclusive content like my old deep dive series and videos like my workflow series, where I do a deep dive into my favorite productivity tools. And it's not trying to be a competitor to YouTube, but it's a place where creators can put content without really worrying about the YouTube algorithm. Like, for example, I wouldn't upload a 2-hour-long interview with bestselling author Ryan Holiday to the main channel because it would be weird to upload an interview to the main channel. Instead, that is over at Nebula. Now, conveniently, the best way to get access to Nebula is by signing up to CuriosityStream, who are very kindly sponsoring this video. If you haven't heard, CuriosityStream is the world's leading documentary streaming subscription platform. And on CuriosityStream, they've got thousands of titles that you can choose from, high quality, high budget documentaries from all sorts of areas like science and technology, through to space and architecture and history and food and medicine and nutrition and everything in between. And because CuriosityStream loves supporting independent creators, we actually have a really cool bundle deal with them, where if you sign up for CuriosityStream, which is less than $15 a year, you will get free access to Nebula bundled with that. So for less than $15 a year, you get access to these thousands of high quality documentaries, and you also get all of the stuff that I've got exclusively on Nebula, including the deep dive interview series, which mirrors the format of these podcasts that have had an enormous impact on my life over the last 5 years. If that sounds up your street, then just head over to curiositystream.com/Ali. And if you sign up over there, you'll get your Nebula details emailed to you, and that makes this probably, almost certainly, the single best deal in the streaming world. So thank you, CuriosityStream, for sponsoring this video, and thank you very much for watching. If you liked this video, you might like to check out some of the interviews I've done on my Deep Dive YouTube channel, which will be linked over there. We've got an interview with Mr. Who's the Boss, who is a tech YouTuber in the UK with 10 million subscribers, an interview with Dr. Julie Smith, who's a clinical psychologist with over 3 million followers on TikTok, who's written a book all about mental health. Loads of that on the Deep Dive channel. Check it out, linked right over there. So thanks for watching. Hit the subscribe button if you aren't already, and I'll hopefully see you in the next video. Bye-bye.